The following recording is fully owned and/or licensed to Christians for Biblical Equality International. No reproduction shall be made without prior written consent from CBE.
I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I do not normally speak about this subject because I haven't researched it in any great detail. I haven't read everything there is to read on the subject by any manner of means, and so I don't claim to be an expert on the various biblical passages that deal with the very pressing issues about women in ministry, women's service in the church, which is the topic you've invited me to take tonight. So I want to offer you some reflections which are very far from complete or fully worked out. I'm not coming down from a great height with all the answers. I'm simply sharing with you the reflections which, as far as I've got so far, and I'm very delighted to be able to welcome you to Durham. I am in fact from the northeast of England myself. You're in the Leach Hall at St John's, and I'm probably the only person present who actually met the man after whom this hall was named, William Leach, who was a great donor and benefactor of many things in the northeast of England, and he lived in the same town as me when I was a very little boy, and he was a very old man, but I did actually meet him on one or two occasions. And so it's a joy to be with you and to be able to welcome you to England, to the northeast of England, to Durham in particular. And I hope you are relishing this wonderful city and all that it has to offer, because it is indeed a place of great joy and indeed a place of great theological learning. There's an immense amount going on here, and it's a privilege for me to be able to come and be part of it. I just want to make one or two introductory remarks by way of kind of oblique observations about the sort of debate that this conference reflects. As I look through the literature, and you were kind enough to send me some of your brochures and some of your bits and pieces, very interesting they were, I had a sense continually of a certain cultural gap between where that literature was and where I habitually am. It seems to me that the issues that CBE is addressing front and center come from, well, a wide variety of contexts, but they did have a particular American feel to me, specific in reflecting some particular American subcultures as well. And that's not to say these are unimportant. They're not the very important. I know a little bit about those subcultures. For instance, some of the issues over inclusive language and different biblical translations, which has been a pitched battle fought out in certain areas, while other bits of the church are completely ignorant of it. And I know how in this, as in many other things, you can't simply transplant American reactions this way and that to other soil and expect the same debate to work the same way. As with reactions to Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion, the way that was debated in America and the way that it's debated in England are really, or in Britain, are really very different. We see things different ways. We have different sets of cultural reactions. And frankly, in my own church at the moment, the Church of England, the problem about women in ministry is not will the evangelical right wing allow us to do certain things, although there are some strident bits here and there, but basically that the Anglo-Catholic movement, or rather its right wing, if that right-left makes any sense, then I don't know if it does, they have all kinds of arguments against women priests and against women bishops, which really don't seem to include very much reflection on Scripture at all. That's not where they're coming from. So that I think what you're doing is splendid. I'm delighted to be here and sharing my 2 cents worth with you, but we must beware about simply transplanting a debate. Whenever you transplant literally anything, you have to watch out, because there are different types of soils, and we need to be careful that we're actually addressing the place where we are. Second observation, I do worry a bit about this word equality and the language of egalitarian. I'm just shooting my mouth off here. You know, I'm leaving after this, and that's all right. Of course, I recognize what's being said with the word equality and its cognates, and that's fine. I affirm what you're affirming by that. But those words, equality and so on, carry so much freight in post-Enlightenment Western culture that I do wonder whether it always helps the cause that you and I want to set forward, simply to use that language all the time. Sometimes those words are a red rag to various bulls who perhaps don't need to be aggravated in that way all the time. And sometimes it can be actually inaccurate and broad, because to some people you can't police what people are going to hear when you use certain language. And some people, when they hear the word equality, they think identical. And you know, you can't stop people thinking that. That's simply a flaw in our culture. But we need to tease things out sometimes times and not just be satisfied with slogans. Likewise, I see in the literature, and I'm showing my ignorance of the debates, the use of the word complementary and its cognates to denote, I assume, a very different position from the one represented by Christians for Biblical Equality, namely a position which says that men and women are so different they have complementary roles, therefore women must not do certain things. I think I want to say that the word complementary is too good a word to let those guys have it all to themselves. I recognise then, as we all must, that this debate takes place within the wider cultural context of multiple overlapping and interlocking debates. It's a complicated jungle out there. You know that, so do I. There are many varieties of feminism, and as soon as you position yourself in relation to one, there's another of the varieties which is shooting at you from that side. There is the ongoing modern, postmodern culture wars thing, which is particularly rife in America but affects us all and actually the whole world. And part of the problem, particularly in the United States at the moment, is that the culture's become so polarized that it's often assumed that if you tick one box out of many moral issues that are out there, you're going to tick all the other boxes down that side of the page, when it's assumed that we know that all these belong on this side and all those belong on that side. One of the reasons the media can't understand Rowan Williams is that he refuses to do that. Ticks this one here and that one there and this one there, and they say he's being inconsistent, and he isn't. He's addressing different issues as he sees them, using all the resources available to him to do that. And I suspect that part of the presenting problem which has generated your movement is precisely the assumption among many American evangelicals that you just have to buy an entire right-wing package, or you're being deeply disloyal and letting the side down. That you exist, I suspect, because you want to say that on this issue, and perhaps on many others as well, like say gun control or Iraq, the standard hard right line across the Atlantic has allowed itself to be conned into a sub-Christian or even unchristian stance. Anyway, enough of that. I just want to flag up the fact that our conversation is taking place within rather complex contexts. And I think we have to warn against any absolutism, any idea that one slogan or one line will simply see us through all the debates. Now, I've been asked to speak not about the relation of the sexes in general, not about men and women in marriage, but about the ministry of women. And that's a welcome limitation of a huge subject, especially as the day has been long and I've been doing other things and so have you, and it could take a long time. I do want to set my remarks within a particular framework of biblical theology to do with Genesis chapter 1. Many people have said, and I've actually said it often enough myself, that the creation of man and woman in their two genders is a vital part of what it means that humans are created in God's image. Now, and I regard that actually as a mistake. After all, in Genesis 1, the animal kingdom are male and female, and they're not in God's image. And even the plant kingdom, this is plants bearing seeds, many plants are noticeably and obviously, in the way they behave and even look, male and female, and that doesn't mean they're made in God's image. This two-gender factor actually runs right through considerable parts of God's good and lovely creation. That doesn't mean it's unimportant. If anything, it means it's all the more important. Being male and being female and working out what to do with that is something most of creation is called to do and be. And unless we are to collapse into a kind of Gnosticism, which says that creation is a shabby secondary thing and we want to do something else instead, get in touch with some mysterious deeper thing, overturning the order of creation, then if we're not going to do that, we've got to recognize and respond to the call of God to live in the world that He's made and be the people He's made us to be. It's just we can't use the argument that being male plus female is the thing that makes us God's image bearers. It clearly isn't. This brings us nicely to the text which you yourselves have made central to your own movement, Galatians 3:28. And the first exegetical section of this paper is going to offer some reflections on that text. I was going to say, if you have it in your hands, look it up. Half of you are sitting in near total darkness, so may not be able to see, but in any case, you all know it by heart. Or do you? Well, that's part of the question. The first thing to say is fairly obvious, but it needs saying anyway. Galatians 3 is not about ministry, nor is it the only thing Paul says about being male and female. And there's always a danger if you take texts in a vacuum, here's a verse here, a verse there, and a little passage somewhere else, and then arrange them in a hierarchy, for instance, by quoting this verse and then declaring as a kind of coup d'etat that it trumps everything else that is ever said anywhere else. That's a very masculine way of approaching exegesis, by the way. Instead of that, we need to do justice to what Paul is actually saying at this point. I'm slightly surprised to see, though it's common enough, the insistence that men and women are equally saved and justified. That is, I'm surprised because I have never heard anyone denying it. Of course, there may well be people who do. Tell me I'm wrong. I just haven't met them. The point that Paul is making overall in this passage is that God has one family, not two, and that this family consists of all those who believe in Jesus Christ without any other differentiation. This is the family, he says, that God promised to Abraham. Nothing in the Torah, in the Jewish law, this is the point of the passage, can stand in the way of the unity which is now revealed through the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah. This is not at all about, therefore, how we relate to one another within the family. That's not what the passage is about. It is about the fact, as we often say, that the ground is even at the foot of the cross. First, a note about translation. I noticed that on one of your leaflets you actually adopt, dare I point it out, a mistranslation of this verse. You say, neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. That's precisely what Paul does not say. And as it's what we all expect he's going to say, the fact that he doesn't means that presumably he's making a point which we're missing if we flatten it out in that way. What he actually says is, there is neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, no male and female. And I think the reason he says no male and female rather than neither male nor female is that he's actually quoting Genesis 1, and that we should understand the phrase male and female in scare quotes. There's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, and there is no male and female. So what does he mean? Does he mean that in Christ the created order has been undone? Is he saying, as some have suggested, that we should go back to a chaos in which no orders of creation apply any longer? Or is he saying that we go on, like the Gnostics, from this first rather shabby creation in which silly things like gender differentiation get in the way, and instead we go into a new world in which we can all live as hermaphrodites, which again, as some have suggested, has interesting ethical spin-offs. Some serious theologians have argued that Paul is pushing in that direction. But no, that's wrong. Paul is a theologian of new creation, of renewed creation. And it's always the renewal and the affirmation, the reaffirmation of the existing creation. Look at Romans 8, look at 1 Corinthians 15, look at the end of Galatians 6, where he says, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision matters, but new creation. Genesis 1 to 3 remains enormously important for Paul throughout his writings, not as something to get away from, but as something to affirm and reaffirm through the gospel. So what is he saying? Remember that he is controverting those in particular who wanted to enforce Jewish regulations and indeed Jewish ethnicity on Gentile converts. Remember the synagogue prayer in which, and it's in the synagogue prayer book to this day, the prayer prays, God, I thank you that you have not made me a Gentile. I thank you that you have not made me a slave. I thank you that you have not made me a woman. At which point the women in the congregation say, God, I thank you that you have made me according to your will. I think Paul is deliberately marking out the family of Abraham, reformed through the Messiah, as a people who cannot pray that prayer, since within this family these distinctions are now irrelevant. And I think there's more. Remember the presenting issue in Galatians is circumcision. Male circumcision, of course. We sometimes think of circumcision as actually a painful obstacle for converts to Judaism. People would put off becoming full Jews, men would, because they'd have to go through this. Indeed, in some ways that was true. But of course, for those who embraced it, it was a matter of pride and privilege and prestige. It not only marked out Jews from Gentiles, it marked them out in a way which automatically privileged males. By contrast, imagine the thrill of equality brought about by baptism, which is the identical right for Jew, Gentile, slave, free, male, female. A woman who's baptized is standing on exactly the same ground as a man who's been baptized. And that's not all. This is somewhat more speculative, but think about it. The story of Abraham's family tended to privilege the male line of descent, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. What we find in Paul in Galatians 4 and in Romans 9 is careful attention being paid, rather like the genealogy in Matthew 1, though in a different line, to the women in the story. If those in Christ are the true family of Abraham, that's the point of what Paul's saying, then the manner of this identity and unity takes a quantum leap beyond the way in which first century Judaism construed them, bringing male and female together as surely and as equally as any Jew and Gentile. I imagine, it is only imagining, as often in Pauline exegesis, we only hear one end of the telephone conversation. We have to speculate as to what somebody, like one of Bob Newhart's monologues, have to speculate as to what was going on at the other end of the line. I imagine somebody saying, but of course the male line is what matters. And of course the male circumcision is what matters, because in Genesis it said God made them male and female, and then he gave us all these male things. So clearly when God said in Genesis male and female, we've got to see that in a hierarchical fashion. And Paul says no, neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, and no, male and female. But once we've grasped that point, we have to take a step back and reflect on what Paul has not done as well as on what he has done. In regard to the Jew-Gentile distinction, Paul's fierce and uncompromising insistence on equality in Christ does not at all mean that we need pay no attention to the distinctives between those of different cultural backgrounds when it comes to living together in the church. Romans 14 and 15 are the best examples of this, where he carefully pays attention to those from the one ethnic background, carefully pays attention to the other, and helps them figure out how to live appropriately together with mutual respect for their different positions. But we can see it also throughout Galatians itself. Often in Galatians, when Paul says we, he means Jewish Christians. We who are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Galatians 2:15. And often when he says you or they, he means Gentile Christians. Often in the argument, the way the exegesis works is by Paul being very much aware that though they have come to the same place, justified by grace through faith in Christ and marked out in baptism and so on, it's the identical place. They've come from very different roots and by a very different means of entry. Jews being renewed in the covenant, Gentiles coming in from outside. Check out Ephesians 2 where you find exactly the same point. The differences between them are therefore not obliterated, and pastoral practice and Paul's writing need to take account of this. They are merely irrelevant when it comes to belonging to the family. And this, I suggest, applies as well, mutatis mutandis, to Paul's treatment of men and women within the Christian family. The difference between being male and being female is irrelevant for membership status and membership badges, but it is still to be taken note of in ways that we haven't yet explored but shall when it comes to pastoral practice. We do not become hermaphrodites, we do not become genderless, sexless beings when we are baptized. Paul would have been the first to reject such a Gnostic suggestion. The idea that the original creation in which we were gloriously made male and female was a shabby, stupid thing done by a bad and inadequate God, and that we've got to go to a different level of God who will go beyond that and enable us to transcend it. No. This is the point at which we must issue a warning against the current fashion in some quarters, particularly in America, for the documents like the so-called Gospel of Mary, read in a Gnostic and a feminist light. That kind of option appears to present a shortcut right to a pro-woman agenda, but it purchases that at a huge cost, theologically, canonically, etc., and historically. And it also presents a very two-edged blessing, because in ancient Gnosticism you find frequently the propensity to flatten out the male-female distinction, not by affirming both as equally important, but by effectively turning women into men. Check out the last saying in the Gospel of Thomas, if you doubt me. The ways in which Paul explores the differences between men and women come elsewhere than in Galatians. I'm going to look at 1 Corinthians and then at 1 Timothy, but before I do that, just want to offer some very brief notes on one or two themes and passages in the Gospels and in Acts. And this is not exhaustive. There are many, many other things we might say. I decided sometime late this morning that there was just no way I was going to say everything I could say in the short time available to me. Among the first things I want to say about the Gospels is that we gain nothing by ignoring or denying the fact that Jesus chose 12 male apostles. I've done a lot of historical Jesus work in my lifetime, and I've often run up against people who say Jesus cannot have chosen 12 male apostles because Jesus was very much pro-women and he would never have done anything like that. Now, you may not have met that argument, but I have, and I just think it's rubbish. You just cannot argue like that historically. But and there were no doubt all kinds of reasons for the choice of 12 men, both within the symbolic world in which Jesus was operating, the 12 standing for the fresh 12 tribes of Israel, who happened all to be headed by males, Jacob's sons, and within the practical and cultural world in which Jesus intended them to have a very specific mission. But every time this point is made, oh, Jesus chose male apostles, therefore, ... we have to comment on how interesting it is that there comes a time when all 12 forsake him and flee. And the ones who are left, long before the rehabilitation of Peter and the others, are those who come first to the tomb, those who are the first to see the risen Jesus, those who are the first to be entrusted with the news that he has been raised from the dead. This is of incalculable significance. Mary Magdalene and the others are apostles to the apostles. We should not be surprised that Paul calls a woman named Junia an apostle in Romans 16. If an apostle is a witness to the resurrection, then there were women apostles before there were men apostles. I note that there was a huge fuss in the translation and revision of the New International Version at the suggestion that maybe Junia was a woman. And I note that in that debate, I have one spy on the committee, that not a single historical or exegetical argument was available to those who kept insisting for quite other reasons that she was actually Junias, a man. Nor is this promotion of women a new thing with the resurrection. As in so many other ways, what happened then picks up hints from Jesus' earlier public career. I think in particular of the woman who anointed Jesus, without going into the question of who it was and whether it happened more than once. As some have pointed out, this was a quasi-priestly action, which Jesus accepted as such. And I think too of the remarkable story of Mary and Martha in Luke 10. I'm sure you all know this point, but we're going to make it anyway. Most of us grew up with the line that Martha was the active type and Mary was the contemplative or passive type, and that Jesus is simply affirming the importance of both and even the priority of devotion to him over rushing around making meals. Now, that devotion is undoubtedly an important part of the story, but what would be far more obvious to any first century reader, and to many readers in Turkey and the Middle East and other parts of the world to this day, is that Mary has taken a place within the male space in the house, instead of in the female space, rather than being kept in the rooms where the women were. Men wouldn't go into female space, and many women rather liked it like that. They had their domain. And women wouldn't go into the male space, and many men rather liked it like that. And I think this is what really bothered Martha. I mean, the surface noise that she's got a lot of hassle in the kitchen and wants some help is no doubt true as well. But the real problem, the gut level thing, is that Mary has taken a large step clean through a major social convention. We shouldn't think these social conventions are odd. Some of you will come from cultures where exactly the same obtains. And if you were to invite me to stay in your house, and when it came to bedtime, if I were to get a camp bed and put it up in your bedroom, I think you'd be a little surprised. I mean, because we have our social rules. We don't talk about them, we assume them. And we assume that guests and hosts don't actually sleep in the same room. But, there are many cultures in which you do. You go to West Malaysia, you'll sleep in a longhouse. Dozens of you in a row. Quite different. We have our clear but unstated rules about whose space is which, and so did they. And Mary just flouted them. And Jesus says she's right to do so. She is sitting at his feet. And please, sitting at his feet does not mean, those girls in Indiana Jones movies, that they're in the film, they're sitting at his feet, gazing up adoringly at this wonderful teacher. That's often the image we have when we read Luke 10. But think of Paul, who talks about himself sitting at the feet of Gamaliel. He's not gazing up gooey-eyed at Gamaliel. He's a student. He's learning. He's drinking in Gamaliel's wisdom and knowledge. The reason you do that is not to further your own intellectual or spiritual advancement, though that'll come too. It's so that you can be a rabbi in turn. Like much in the Gospels, this story seems a little cryptic to us, but I doubt if any first century reader would have missed the point. And that is no doubt part, at least, of the reason why we find so many women in positions of leadership in the church, and why that doesn't seem controversial. We don't have arguments saying we must allow Phoebe to be a deacon, and how can you possibly suggest she shouldn't be? Of course Junior is an apostle, how can anyone say differently? Nobody was denying it, nobody was contradicting them. I used to think Romans 16 was the most boring chapter in that wonderful letter. I now put it on a par with all the others. There are no boring chapters in Romans. As I study the names and think about them, I'm struck by how powerfully they indicate the way in which the teaching both of Jesus and Paul was being worked out in practice. One other point about Acts, something among many others I gleaned from Ken Bailey, who some of you will know, a wonderful senior scholar, lives in Pittsburgh now, on the basis of his long experience of working in the Middle East. It's interesting that at the crucifixion, the women were able to come and go without fear of the authorities while the men were in hiding. The women were not regarded as a threat. They did not expect to be so regarded. And Bailey points out that this pattern has been repeated to this day in places where there's been major social upheaval. He lived and worked in Lebanon during the Troubles. And he said that men on all sides in the factional fighting were either in hiding or going about with great caution with bodyguards and bulletproof vests and goodness knows what. But the women were free to come and go, to do the shopping, to take children out, to do whatever was necessary. I think this tells us something as well about the age of the beloved disciple. What was he doing at the cross? But that's a whole other issue. But it's then fascinating that when we turn to Acts and look at the persecution that happens at the time of the Stephen martyrdom, we find that women are being targeted alongside the men. Saul goes to Damascus to seize women and men, take them into custody. Why? Bailey points out, on the basis of the cultural parallels, it only makes sense if the women too are being seen as leaders within this community. Having mentioned Paul's abortive attempts to catch Christians in Damascus, it's now high time to return to Paul's mature thought and look at the three key passages which have often caused difficulty. A couple of them in 1 Corinthians and then 1 Timothy. Sorry, I'm going rather fast. It is late at night. I need to get home, so you need to go to bed, whatever. There's been an enormous amount of work done on 1 Corinthians recently on the social and cultural context. PhDs are coming out all the time on the significance of the archaeology, the inscriptions, etc., etc. Bruce Winter in Cambridge, who some of you know, has done a fantastic job of writing up some of this and making it available. I want to urge all those who are interested in finding out what Paul actually said and meant to study such work with great care. I haven't researched it all in detail. I haven't had the time the last few years. But there are many things about first century classical life which shed a great deal of light on the actual issues Paul is addressing. They need to be taken carefully into account. They don't always make the passages come out exactly as you or I might want. Tough. You know, if we're committed to historical study of what the texts actually say, let's go with it, and let's be cheerful and courageous as we do so. I want instead to home in on one of the two passages which has caused so much difficulty. The passage at the end of 1 Corinthians 14, in which Paul insists that women must keep silent in church. That's 1 Corinthians 14 from verse 34, 35 and 36. Now, I'm in two minds whether to agree with those who say that this is actually a later and non-Pauline interpolation. In other words, somebody stuck it in later on into a manuscript. Normally, when scholars say this, it's simply that they haven't thought through the passage and they're using this as an excuse to get rid of it. That's happened in dozens of cases in New Testament scholarship. But here, there is actual manuscript evidence for these verses coming and going in different copies of the text at different stages. And one of the greatest textual critics of the last generation, Gordon Fee of Regent College, Vancouver, and before that of Gordon College, has argued that it is very, very strongly that it is purely on the grounds of the way the manuscript tradition appears that it is in fact an interpolation. And I urge you to examine his arguments in his commentary and make up your own minds. But I've always been attracted, ever since I heard it, to the explanation offered again by Ken Bailey. I heard Bailey talk about this stuff in a paper in Oxford, maybe nearly 10 years ago now, and I was just so struck by it, and I don't even know, he must have written it up somewhere, I haven't got the reference, but I could find it. Bailey says that in the Middle East it was, of course in the early church, taken for granted, as it is in many parts of the world still today, that men and women sit on opposite sides in church. That's simply again how some cultures work. It seems so counterintuitive to us in the West, but that is taken for granted as the norm in some circles today. And equally important, the service would be held in, as it were, the proper language in the culture, not in the local patois or dialect, but in the slightly higher social language. Today it would be, in the Middle East, classical Arabic, whereas a lot of the people would not actually speak that on a daily basis. And usually it would be the men who would understand the classical language and the women who would speak the local dialect that they would hear in the markets and so on. Again, we may disapprove of an arrangement like that, but one of the things you learn in real pastoral work, as opposed to ivory tower academic theorizing, is that you simply can't take a community all the way from where it currently is to where you would ideally like it to be in one flying leap. Believe me, as a bishop, I know it can't be done. Anyway, the results would be that during the sermon, supposing we'd done it tonight and all the women are sitting here and all the men were sitting here, and because this is the way we did it, I was preaching in the mainstream big language of the time, but all the women spoke various local dialects and patois, the women would get bored. They wouldn't understand what was going on. They would start to talk among themselves. And Bailey describes the scene as he has experienced it in such a church. The level of the talking would gradually increase until the minister would have to say, "Will the women please be quiet?" Whereupon the talking would die down again for a minute or two. And then at some point the minister would ask them again to be quiet. Look, if you want to know what's going on, you're going to have to ask your husbands when you get home. That makes a lot of sense socioculturally. I'm not saying that is the right explanation. But from those situations, I'm standing firmly on Ken Bailey's shoulders, I haven't experienced it myself, it does make a lot of sense. After all, Paul's central concern in 1 Corinthians 14 is for order and decency in the church's worship, and this would fit extremely well. What the passage cannot possibly mean is that women must never speak during the service, because 1 Corinthians 11, they're doing it, and Paul is giving regulations for how they should do it. You cannot privilege 1 Corinthians 14 to the extent that you squelch 1 Corinthians 11. I have to say, first time I was in Jerusalem, there was a near riot at the Western Wall because some of the Jewish women in their enclosure, which is fenced off, were praying out loud. And the right-wing rabbis disapproved because the Torah says, as you know, that a woman's voice is an incitement to lasciviousness. And so some of them were trying to stop the women doing that by the interesting means of hurling chairs across the barrier. I mean, in 1 Corinthians 11, almost everything else other than that point, that women are clearly leading out loud in worship, is very, very difficult. One of the reasons I have never actually written very much about men and women in Pauline communities is because nobody actually knows, at least I've never read anyone who actually knows, what 1 Corinthians 11 verses 2 and following really does mean. So I'm just going to give you a few guesses. Whether they're educated guesses or not is up to you to decide. This is verses 2 to 16. You know the passage, I'm sure. Again, Bruce Winter's work needs to be factored into this in terms of the social situation of women and the different social claims that different groups of women were making at the time in Corinth. Until we've actually got all of that on the table, the full story hasn't been heard. Paul was not, of course, addressing the social situations we know in our world. That doesn't mean everything he says is irrelevant. It just means we've got to get some three-dimensional critical thought going on here. You visit a different culture today, even today, you will discover many subtle assumptions and pressures and constraints in society, some of which appear in the way people dress and wear their hair. In Western culture, a man wouldn't go to a dinner party wearing a bathing costume, nor would a woman attend a beach picnic wearing a wedding dress. You know, we have our social conventions, and you'd be jolly embarrassed if you turn up wearing the wrong stuff. Many Western churches have completely stopped putting pressure on women to wear hats in church. I grew up with most women going to church wearing hats, and that was not in an evangelical church, just an ordinary middle-of-the-road Anglican church. It was just assumed, even though, of course, hats as we know them in the Western world are very unlike the kind of veils that Paul would have had in mind in the first century. But interestingly, nobody thinks it odd that we are still very strict about men not wearing hats in church. We've were easy on the one and were still very keen on the other. The ushers in Westminster Abbey, when I worked there, one of their main jobs was when male tourists came in, to whip their baseball caps off them and say, no, sorry, not in here. So that nearly caused a riot once or twice. I mean, some people are born with baseball caps these days. That's not a particularly culturally insensitive remark. In Paul's day, as in many ways in ours, gender was marked by hairstyles and clothing styles. We can tell from statues and vase paintings and other artwork of the period how this worked out in practice. There was social pressure to maintain appropriate distinctions. But distinctions? Surely Galatians 3 kicks in. No male and female, you're all one in the Messiah. Maybe indeed that was one of the early traditions that Paul had taught the Corinthian church. They needed to know there was neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, no male and female. That all were equally welcomed and valued in the renewed people of God. Perhaps that had actually created the situation he's addressing here. Perhaps some of the Corinthian women had been taking him literally, so that when they prayed or prophesied aloud in church meetings, which Paul assumes they will do regularly, they decided to remove their normal head covering, perhaps also unbraiding their hair, to show that in the Messiah they were free from normal social conventions, the conventions by which men and women were distinguished. That's rather a lot of perhapses. Notice most exegesis of 1 Corinthians 11 is full of perhapses. It ought to be. We can only guess at the dynamics of the situation, though that is what historians always do. But perhaps to the Corinthians' surprise, Paul doesn't congratulate the women on this new expression of freedom. He insists on maintaining appropriate gender differentiation during worship, which does not mean men lead and women don't lead. They both lead. They must be men and women, not some genderless or hermaphroditic being while they're doing it. That appears to be what's going on. Another dimension to this problem, I'm sure you know this, is that in the Corinth of his day, the only women who appeared in public without some kind of head covering were prostitutes, or those who felt sufficiently free to be prepared to dress or act as if they were prostitutes, or to be regarded as such. This isn't suggested directly here, but may well have been in the back of his mind. If the watching world discovered that in the Christian assemblies there were meetings where the women let their hair down, giving those vibes about sexual availability and so on, it could have the same effect on the reputation of the tiny and beleaguered little Christian church as it would in the modern West if someone looked into a church and found all the women wearing bikinis. What's going on here? And then it'd be in the press, it'd be gossiped on the street, etc. Paul is very concerned about the public image of the church, and rightly so. Of course, we run the risk of explaining Paul in terms that might perhaps make sense to us while ignoring bits of what he says. It's tempting to do that precisely because in today's Western world we don't like the implications of the differentiation that he maintains in verse 3. The Messiah is the head of every man, the husband is the head of every woman, the head of the Messiah is God. This seems to place males, in a position of exactly that assumed superiority against which women have often rebelled, often using Galatians 3:28 as their battle cry. What does Paul mean by head here? This is a whole lecture in itself, as most of you know. Here he sometimes uses it in a metaphorical sense, as in verse 3, and sometimes literally, as when he's talking about what to do with actual human heads, verses 4 to 7 and then verse 10. But the word he uses can mean different things, and a good case can be made out for saying that in verse 3 he is referring not to headship in the sense of sovereignty, but to headship in the sense of source. The word kephale and the Hebrew roots that stand behind it can mean source, like the source or head of a river. In fact, in some of the key passages where he explains what he's saying, verses 8 and 9 and 12a, he's referring explicitly to the creation story in Genesis 2, where woman was made from the side of man. And I suspect, in fact, that this is quite a different use of the idea of headship from that which we find in Ephesians 5, where it relates, of course, to husbands and wives, and a very, very different point is being made. Doesn't mean Paul couldn't have written both passages, only that he was freer than we sometimes imagine to modify his own metaphors according to different contexts. The underlying point then seems to be that in worship it is important for both men and women to be their truly created selves, to honor God by being what they are and celebrating it, and not blurring the lines by pretending to be something else. Women don't have to become honorary men, as some of the early Gnostics tried to make out. One of the unspoken clues to this passage may be Paul's assumption that in worship the creation is actually being restored, that worship is a little bit of new creation coming forward to meet us. God made humans male and female and gave them authority over the world. And if humans are to reclaim this authority over the world in prayer and in worship, this will come about as they worship the true God, as they pray and prophesy in his name, and as they are renewed in his image, and, because this isn't, as I said, the same point, are what they are made to be, celebrating the identity that God has given them. And by that I mean the gendered, bodily, sexual gender identity. If this is Paul's meaning, the critical move he makes is to argue that a man dishonors his head by covering it in worship, and that a woman dishonors hers by not covering it. And he argues this mainly from the basis that creation itself tends to give men shorter hair and women longer. The fact that some cultures and some people offer exceptions to this would not have worried Paul. His main point is that in worship, men should follow the dress and hair codes that say that they are male, and women should follow the dress and hair codes which say that they are female. And okay, in different cultures it changes, etc. In my lifetime, when I grew up, when I was very young, virtually no women wore trousers except for very special occasions, like playing cricket or something. But all that's changed. So why does he say that a woman must have authority on her head because of the angels, verse 10? Puzzling verse and a puzzling passage. There's some help in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where when God's people meet for worship, it is assumed that the angels are there as well. We all ought to assume that actually they got it right, and we often forget. But for the scrolls, this means that the angels, being holy, must not be offended by unholiness within the congregation. Paul, I think, is making a slightly different point. Yes, the angels are around. They're worshipping along with us, because worship is actually an activity that takes place in heaven, and we are part of the earthly arm of that. When humans are renewed in the Messiah and raised from the dead, he says in chapter 6, verse 3, that they'll be given authority over the angels. Interesting. And in worship, the church anticipates how it is to be in that future day. And when a woman is praying or prophesying, perhaps in the language of angels, as in chapter 13, she needs to be truly what she is, since it is to male and female alike, in their identity and mutual interdependence as God's creatures, that the world, including the angels, is to be subject. God's creation needs human beings to be fully, gloriously and truly human, which means males being truly and fully male and females being truly and fully female. And this and much else besides is to be already glimpsed in worship. The Corinthians then may have drawn the wrong conclusions from the tradition that Paul had taught them. Whether or not they could follow his argument any better than we can, it seems clear that his main aim was that the marks of differences between the sexes should not be set aside in worship, at least perhaps. We face different issues, but making sure our worship is ordered appropriately to honor God's creation and anticipate its fulfillment in the new creation must still remain the priority, and there's no perhaps about that. When we apply this to the question of women's ministry, it seems to me we should certainly stress equality in the roles to which women are called, but should be very careful about implying identity. I remember the great service in Lichfield Cathedral, my first year as dean there, 10 years ago now, 1994 it was, when for the first time women were ordained in Lichfield Cathedral. The preacher on that day was Mary Gray, who's a Roman Catholic woman theologian. It was a nice little move by the bishop to get a Roman Catholic woman to preach for that service. And she argued very strongly in her sermon that this was a great day because women bring all kinds of gifts to the ordained ministry that men by and large do not bring. In other words, she was assuming difference and saying we need those gifts in priestly ministry as well. Some of my colleagues were shocked because they had been spending the previous 10 years arguing that we must ordain women because there is no difference between them and us. That's the debate, isn't it? that we've often had. I think Paul, in this passage, would tell strongly on the side of Mary Gray. All this points us on towards the final and, of course, the hardest passage of all, which is 1 Timothy 2. I'm sorry I'm going on. Please bear with me. I'm on page 12 and I finish on page 15, so there's not far to go. I leave completely aside for this evening the question of who wrote 1 Timothy. You'll be glad to know. It is different from much of the rest of Paul, but people write differently in different situations. I do it myself. But that doesn't prove anything. What matters is, of course, what the passage says. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I suggest that it is this passage, 1 Timothy 2, far and away above all others, which has been the sheet anchor for those who want to deny women a place in the ordained ministry. I appreciate that some of you come from churches where you don't call what you do with your leaders, elders, whatever, ordination, but you can make the translation and forgive an Anglican late at night for just using his own language. Once again, the matter is, of course, very vexed and fought over. I have not read more than a fraction of the enormous literature. I possess lots of books on this and articles on this, and I've only read some of them. And the stuff is coming out all the time. And I'm just giving my opinion for what it's worth. And I want to acknowledge help from another source, Christopher Bryan of the University of the South at Sewanee. I had a very illuminating conversation with him a year or so ago, and he gave me an article which he'd written, and I've actually pilfered stuff from that, and what I'm going to say comes more or less straight out of my little commentary, Paul for Everyone, the Pastoral Epistles, so you can go and read it there again to check whether you really did hear some of the bizarre things I'm going to say. When people say that the Bible enshrines patriarchal ideas and attitudes, it's this passage they often have in mind, particularly verse 12. Women mustn't be teachers, the verse seems to say. They mustn't hold any authority over men. They must keep silent. That's how many translations put it. I was once reading those verses out loud in a church service, and a woman sitting near the front exploded loudly in anger, to the consternation of the rest of the congregation, even though some of them actually agreed with her anger. The whole passage seems to be saying that women are second-class citizens at every level. They aren't even allowed to dress prettily, for goodness sake. They are the daughters of Eve, and she was the original troublemaker. And the best thing for them to do is to get on and have children and to behave themselves and keep quiet. Well, thanks. That's how most people read the passage in our culture until quite recently. And I fully acknowledge that the different reading I'm going to give you now may sound, to begin with, as though I'm simply trying to make things easier, to tailor this bit of Paul to fit our culture. But there is good, solid scholarship behind what I'm going to say, and I genuinely believe it may be at least pointing in the right direction. And, of course, it has this great advantage that all the other evidence that I've cited points in this direction as well. When you look at strip cartoons and B-grade movies and Z-grade or Z-grade for the Americans among you, and novels and poems, you pick up a standard view of how everyone imagines men and women behave. Men are macho, loud-mouthed, arrogant thugs, always fighting and wanting their own way. Women are simpering, empty-headed creatures with nothing to think about except clothes and jewelry. There are Christian versions of this story as well. The men must make the decisions and run the show and be in the lead and tell everyone what to do, and the women have to stay at home and look after the children. And if you want a biblical backup for this view, well, Genesis 3, Adam would never have sinned if Eve hadn't given in first, and she has her punishment and its pain in childbearing. That's how many, many people have read this. Well, you don't have to embrace every aspect of women's liberation in order to find that interpretation hard to swallow. Sticks in our throat as a way of treating half the human race doesn't fit with the rest of the New Testament, which we've seen. The key to the present passage is to recognize that it is commanding that women too should be allowed to study and learn. Remember Mary? And should not be restrained from doing so. Verse 11. They are to be in full submission. This is often assumed to be to the men, to the husbands, but it is at least equally likely that it refers to their attitude as learners of submission to God or the gospel, which of course will be true for the men as well. And then the crucial verse 12 need not be read as, I do not allow a woman to teach or hold authority over a man. That's the translation which has caused so much difficulty. It can equally mean, and in context this makes much more sense, I do not mean to imply that I am now setting up women as the new authority over men in the same way that previously men held authority over women. And this replacing of one authority with another may be what that blessed word authentine, which is a hapax legomenon at the middle of the Greek verse, may actually mean. And why might Paul need to stress this point? Well, there are some signs in the letter that it was originally sent to Timothy while he was in Ephesus, and that's so even if the letter is fictively by Paul. One of the main things we know about religion in Ephesus is that the main religion, the biggest temple, the most famous shrine, was a female-only cult, the Temple of Artemis, who the Romans called Diana. Massive structure. Some of you will have seen the area. It dominated the area, and as befitted worshippers of a female deity, the priests were all women. They ruled the show and kept the men on the side in their place. Now, if you are writing a letter to someone in a small new religious movement with a base in Ephesus, and you wanted to say that because of the gospel of Jesus, the old ways of organizing male and female rules had to be rethought from top to bottom, with one feature being that now the women were to be encouraged to have the leisure to study and to do what Mary was doing and to learn the stuff so that they could in turn be teachers, you might well want to avoid giving the wrong impression. Is the apostle saying, people might wonder, that women should be trained up so that Christianity would gradually become a cult like that of Artemis, with women taking the lead and men being squeezed out? It seems to me that is what verse 12 is denying. It's ruling out that misunderstanding of saying women must be allowed the leisure to study. The word I've translated, I'll read you my translation in a minute, try to dictate to them, is unusual, but it seems to have the overtones of being bossy or seizing control. Paul is saying, like Jesus in Luke 10, that women must have the space and leisure to study in their own way, not in order that they may muscle in and take over the leadership as though this was a new version of the Artemis cult, but so that men and women alike can develop all the gifts of learning, teaching, and leadership that God is giving them. What's the point of the other bits of the passage then? Verse 8 is clear. Notice, the men must give themselves to devout prayer and must not follow the normal male stereotypes. No anger or arguing. You know, Paul is saying, we all know about the B-grade movies. Don't be like that. You don't have to be like that just because you're male. And then verses 9 and 10 make the same point about the women. They must be set free from their negative cultural stereotype of being empty-headed little things who are only concerned about getting their hair done and having new jewellery. But they must be set free not in order to be dowdy, unobtrusive little mice. Give me a break. But so that they can make a creative contribution to the wider society. Paul says they must do good works. And we think, oh yeah, making the tea and stuff. No, in that context, the phrase doing good works means being public benefactors. It means that they must get out there and make things happen in the society. If that means paying for a new hospital to be built, if that means working on the organization of some social project which is going to make things better for people, that's the kind of good works we're talking about, not just doing fussy little Christian things in the background. It's being people like Phoebe and Lydia in the early church, helping with public works and the arts and so on, being a benefactor of the whole community. Why then does Paul finish off with the explanation about Adam and Eve? Remember that his basic point is to insist that women too must be allowed to learn and study as Christians and not be kept in unlettered, uneducated boredom and drudgery. Well, the story of Adam and Eve makes the point well. Look what happened when Eve was deceived. Women need to learn. They need to be given responsibility. Adam sinned quite deliberately. He was in real trouble. The Old Testament is very stern about that. Eve needs to get to the point where she's not just kept as a pseudo-child, but can actually grow up. Now, what about the bit about childbirth? Paul doesn't see that as a punishment. Rather, he offers an assurance that, though childbirth is indeed difficult and painful and dangerous, often the most testing moment in a woman's life, this is not a curse which must be taken as a sign of God's displeasure, as some almost certainly thought on the basis of their reading of Genesis 3. God's salvation is promised to all, women and men alike, all who follow Jesus in faith and love and holiness and patience. And that salvation is promised to those who contribute to God's creation through childbearing, just as it is to everyone else. Remember the ways in which, in many societies, not only in Judaism, and many up to this day, childbearing was thought to be not only dangerous and difficult, but somehow unclean, so that you needed to be cleansed and purified from it. Becoming a mother is hard enough, God knows, without pretending it's somehow an evil thing. Let's not leave that implication lying around like an unexploded mine. Let's read this text as I believe it was intended, as a way of building up God's church, men and women, women and men alike. And just as Paul was concerned to apply this in one particular situation, so we must think and pray carefully about where our own cultures, our own prejudices, and yes, our own angers are taking us. We live in a world where the only real moral high ground is claiming that you're a victim. That's not a very good way of doing moral argument. When we hear ourselves doing it, let's say, there are better ways of making this point. Otherwise, you just have this endless scramble for that pseudo-moral high ground, and we know what that looks like. Think of the Middle East. We must make sure that we conform not to any of the different stereotypes the world offers, whether stereotypes of this or that culture, the right or the left or whatever, but rather to the healing, liberating, humanizing message of the gospel of Jesus. Let me just read you my translation of this passage. This is what I want. The men and this is in my commentary, Paul for Everyone, the Pastorals, so you can get it there. This is what I want. The men should pray in every place, lifting up holy hands, with no anger or disputing. In the same way, the women too should clothe themselves in an appropriate manner, modestly and sensibly. They should not bother about elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. Instead, as is appropriate for women who profess to be godly, they should adorn themselves with good works. Remember what I said that meant. They must be allowed to study undisturbed, in full submission to God. I am not implying that women should always teach men or try to dictate to them. They should be left undisturbed. Adam was created first, you see, and then Eve, and Adam wasn't deceived, but the woman was deceived and fell into trespass. She will, however, be kept safe through the process of childbirth if she continues in faith, love, and holiness with prudence. That's, at least, I believe, a possible and arguable reading of the passage. Now, it's high time to sum up. I'm sorry I've gone on so long. I think I've said enough to show you where I think the evidence points. I believe we have often seriously misread the relevant passages in the New Testament, not least, no doubt, through a long process of assumption and tradition and all kinds of sub-biblical and post-biblical attitudes that have crept into Christianity. Just one parallel example that I bang on about a lot. Many Christians still think the only eschatological name of the game is, are you going to heaven or are you going to hell? They didn't get that from the New Testament. They got it from Dante. They got it from all kinds of medieval iconography. They got it from the Sistine Chapel, etc. When the New Testament uses the word heaven, it's not talking about the ultimate destiny. Heaven is important, but it's not the end of the world. This is a whole other topic. When the New Testament talks about where we're ultimately to be, it talks about the new heavens and the new earth, which is, for goodness sake, why we need resurrection bodies. Going to heaven is the temporary state before the fire. But we've all been conned by our hymns and our prayers and our poems and our medieval traditions, which we still cling on to. So we fail to read the New Testament for all it's worth. Something exactly similar, I think, has happened with the men-women thing. We've got to get back to the biblical models in order to go forward in the love of God. I do wonder sometimes if those who present radical challenges to Christianity have been all the more eager to make out that the Bible says certain things about women as an excuse for claiming that Christianity is in general is a wicked thing and we ought to abandon it. I've heard that on the edge of many arguments. And of course there have been many Christians who've given outsiders plenty of chances to make that kind of comment. But perhaps in our generation we have a chance to take a large step back in the right direction. And I hope and pray that this conference and the work of this society may be used by God in exactly that way. Thank you.